So there are many layers of affection. We have affection for our kids, for our wives and husbands, for our friends, but the highest layer of affection is for those people who gave your kids a job. And so I have a special affection for Kennedy and Jessica because they gave my son a job. About 3 or 4 years ago, he got to teach these little girls at Shofco. And I would say his moral compass was completely transformed. He was a jockish, much bigger than me athlete in school. And he sent me a video toward the end of his time, and he's with the little girls, and they're doing this catwalk, runway walk. And he's doing it too, and I'd never seen that from him. And so they had changed at least one life in my family. And so it's a special pleasure to be here for Shofco and Jessica and Kennedy. And it occurs to me when I think of them that I could use their work. I really should go to Shofco myself for a couple years because I am not the most emotionally open person on the face of the earth. I'm sort of bookish. When I was 7, I read this book called Paddington the Bear, and I decided to become a writer. And I've been writing pretty much every day since then. And in high school, I wanted to date this girl named Bernice. She didn't want to date me, she wanted to date some other guy. And I remember thinking, what is she thinking? I write way better than that guy. And so our values, so that was where I was locked in. Then when I was 18, the admissions officers at Wesleyan and Columbia and Brown decided I should go to the University of Chicago. Wesleyan was my top choice, but I got rejected. And so it's also a very bookish, intellectual place. The best saying about it is it's a Baptist school where atheist professors teach Jewish students St. Thomas Aquinas. And so the kids wear a t-shirt that says, sure it works in practice, but does it work in theory? And so I had a bookish life there. I had a double major in history and celibacy while I was there. But I did master intellectual skills, the ability which my students at Yale have to dominate classroom discussion while doing none of the reading. And then I went off and became a pundit, which is sort of a bookish, cerebral sort of activity. Some of you, I hope, know that I do a show, I'm about to go do it, called The News Hour on PBS, which even for TV is sort of cerebral version of TV. We have a certain demographic that we cater to, which is experienced demographic. So I know if a 93-year-old lady walks up to me in the airport, I know what she's going to say. I don't watch your show, but my mother loves it. And so we're very big in the hospice community. It's very core. And I'm a columnist, conservative columnist at the New York Times, which is a job I liken to being the chief rabbi at Mecca. Not a lot of company there all the time, but again, bookish. But I think as you get older, you get hopefully a little more emotionally available, and I hope that's happened to me. I'm the only American male to finish that book, Eat, Pray, Love. For example, by page 123, I was lactating, which was amazing. Then I wrote a book about emotion called The Social Animal, and my friends joke that me writing a book about emotion is like Gandhi writing about gluttony, not the normal thing. And then I read a book on character building, and I learned from that if you write a book on character, it doesn't actually give you good character. And even if you read a book on character, it doesn't give you good character. But if you buy a book on character, it does give you good character, so I recommend it. And so all this to say is, I'm not the most attached person on earth. And yet I have to admit that the conscious, the rational mind is the third most important part of our consciousness. And the first is the desiring heart. I read about a guy who bought a house with a bamboo stand next to the driveway, and he didn't like it, so he chopped down the bamboo, he took an axe to the root system, he poured plant poison over what was left, put 3 feet of gravel, and then cement over the top. And 2 years later, little shoot of bamboo coming up. And in my view, we all have something like that in ourselves, which is our desires. And mostly our desires for attachment, to attach to one another. And the ultimate desire is to fuse with somebody else, somebody you really love. Fusing the way, as Louis de Bernier described it in his book, Captain Corelli's Mandolin. He's got an old guy early in that book talking to his daughter about his late wife. And the guy says, love itself is what is left over when being in love is burned away. And this is both an art and a fortunate accident. Your mother and I had it. We had roots that grew towards each other underground. And when all the pretty blossoms had fallen from our branches, we discovered that we were one tree and not two. And that's what we want. That's what the yearning heart wants. The other important part of our consciousness is the yearning soul. Now, I don't ask you to believe in God or not believe in God. That's not my department. But I ask you to believe that you have a soul, that there's some piece of you that has no shape, size, color, or weight, but is of infinite dignity. Rich and successful people don't have it more than poor, and less successful, old, don't have it more than young. That slavery is wrong because it's an obliteration of a human soul. That rape is not just an assault on a bunch of physical molecules, it's an obliteration of someone's soul. And so obscenity is anything that covers over a human soul. And what our soul does is yearn. It yearns to be righteous. I've covered wars, I've covered people who've committed genocide, I've covered crime. I've never met anybody who didn't want to be good. And even the people who do the worst things have some rationalization for why what they did was actually good. And this yearning for righteousness, to feel right with the world, is to me a profound drive that we underestimate in our culture. And I notice a lot of people their life have a two-mountain shape. They start their career, they're building their career, they think that's my mountain to climb. Then they succeed and they find it unsatisfying, and they find a second mountain. And the first mountain is about acquiring, but the second mountain is about pouring forth and giving back. And I find this over and over. And what people yearn for is joint service with others towards some ideal. The kind of experience that Rabbi Wolf Kelman described when he marched in Selma with Martin Luther King. We felt connected in song to the transcendental, the ineffable. We felt triumph and celebration. We felt that things change for the good and nothing is congealed forever. That was the warmest transcendental experience. Meaning and purpose and mission were beyond exact words. Meaning was the feeling, the song, the moment of overwhelming spiritual fulfillment. When people have surrendered themselves to a moral cause, they get that sense of deep satisfaction. And we unfortunately have a culture that doesn't often encourage that. We have a culture that's grown overly individualistic, overly cognitive, and unemotional. And I wrote this book on the difference between the resume virtues and the eulogy virtues. And the resume virtues are the things that make you good at your job. The eulogy virtues are the things they say about you after you're dead, whether you're honest, capable, courageous, of great love. And we talk a lot more about how to build a good career than how to build good character. And as a result of a culture that's overly individualistic, overly rationalistic, overly oriented on the myth that success produces happiness, we have created a culture in which a lot of us are strangers to each other. We've created a culture with overlapping social crises. The first is the crisis of isolation. 35% of Americans 45 and older are chronically lonely. If a generation ago, married couples entertained friends in their homes an average of 15 times a year, now the number is 8 times a year. Only 8% of Americans report having important conversations with their neighbors. Suicide rates have been rising since 1999 and are now at a high. The teen suicide rate between 2006 and 2016 rose 70%. 45,000 people now kill each other every year, roughly the amount that died over the entire course of the Vietnam War. 55,000 die of opiate addiction. That's 2 Vietnam Wars every year. The second problem, aside from loneliness, is distrust. It used to be if you asked people, do you trust the institutions of society, 70 and 80% said yes. Now it's down to 22%. It used to be if you asked people, can you trust your neighbors, 60% of Americans said, yeah, my neighbors are trustworthy. Now it's down to 32% and 19% of millennials. The younger you go down the age cohorts, the more distrust there is. And so what we've done as a culture is to leave people naked and alone. And when you leave people naked and alone, they do what their evolutionary roots tell them to do. They revert to tribe. Tribalism seems like community, but it's the dark form of community because it's not based on common affection, it's based on mutual hatred. And so we have groups of people, what the political scientists call negative polarization. What do you think about your own party? What do you think about the other party? They're horrible. And so tribalism is always based on us-them distinctions, friend-enemy distinctions. It's based on mistrust, suspicion, politics is war, build walls, erect barriers. And this has been the moral and social recession that we've gone into that makes topics like this necessary. So I spent a lot of time thinking, how do cultures turn themselves around? How do you rebuild a moral compass? Well, the classic way is to unite in war. And so I used to joke, well, it would be nice if Canada invaded us, but now with the trade disputes, that may actually happen, so I don't joke about that anymore. But it did happen in the late 19th century and the early 20th century. There was a cultural revival. The social gospel movement replaced social Darwinism. There was a civic revival. There was the creation of the Boys and Girls Clubs, the Boys and Girl Scouts, the NAACP, the temperance movement, the settlement house movement, the environmental movement, all within a few years. And then finally, there was the political revival, the progressive movement. Now, I think there's some cultural revival coming, but there's certainly a civic revival. Millions of Americans all around the country are rising up to deal with this problem of broken relationship and trying to heal divides across class, across race, across party. And I've helped found an organization called Weave, the Social Fabric Project at the Aspen Institute, and we basically go around the country and try to celebrate these people and shift the culture around them. How does culture shift? It shifts because people, often on the margins of society, find a better way to live, and other people copy them. And when I think of the people that I look at, and frankly the people like Kennedy and Jessica, they found a better way to live, a more joyous way to live. I got involved in an organization in DC. About 5 years ago, I went to a home of a couple I didn't know, but I was brought to their home. I looked in their basement, there were 15 mattresses on the floor. It turns out they had a kid who was in the DC public schools, and that kid who had a friend who didn't have a good place to eat or sleep. His home life was messed up. And so they said, well, James can stay with us. And then that kid had a friend, and that kid had a friend, and that kid had a friend. And so now when you go to their house on Thursday nights, there's 40 kids there, and there are about 15 sleeping somewhere around the house. A couple are farmed out to other homes in the community. I reach in, I try to shake the hand of one of the kids my first night, and he says, we don't shake hands here. We hug here. And so as I said, I'm not the most huggy guy, but I've been hugging every day for every week and for the last 5 years with these kids. And it is, this group, this community, AOK, about 40 or 50 kids, and a few of us adults, this is the answer to the problem of social connection, this kind of organization. Yesterday, one of the young women, a woman named Madeline, had a kidney failure. And so yesterday at 10 a.m., the father from this family donated his kidney to her. And so it's just, that's what communities do. And that is the connection. And I find these people everywhere. We roll into towns. We're going to Nebraska next week, Wilkesboro, North Carolina. You find 40 or 50 of them in a day. And what they're doing is they're rising up and creating the bonds of social connection. And some of them are red, some of them are blue, but they all use the same moral vocabulary. They have a moral motivation. They're not driven by a desire for money, for power, for status. They just want to feel right for the world. They assume responsibility without even thinking about it that much. If there's a problem in their community, they just assume responsibility for it. They have technologies to deepen relationships. They hunger for intimacy and connection, and they invent ways to do it. Sometimes it's a dinner table. At Becoming a Man in Chicago, they have gang members get together, and they have to check in, tell each other how they're doing spiritually, emotionally, physically, and intellectually. And if they're not completely vulnerable with each other, the other guys get on them. And so it's a way to create what at Thread, a Baltimore institution, calls showing all the way up, being completely vulnerable with each other. They believe in radical mutuality. It's never from high to low. This organization, Thread in Baltimore, is basically a mentorship program, but the word mentor is banned because it implies somebody is teaching somebody else from high to low. There's complete equality. So they've got this is what I do mentality. It's a personalist approach. And to me, that is the cultural revolution. Not dealing with somebody as just an intellect, not a career, but a complete whole person. And the phrase I've heard most on this tour than any other is whole person. How do we deal with the whole person? And how do you teach that? There's a great group called Roots of Empathy, started by a woman named Mary Gordon. And the way they teach empathy is they take an infant and a mom, and they take into a school classroom. And so the kids have to watch the relationship. They have to figure out what the kid is thinking, and it gives them the ability to enter into another mind. It gives them the ability to see what an attachment is like between a mother and a child. One of the kids, Mary took a baby to in the classroom there was a kid named Darren, and the kids are like 10 or 11, but Darren was 13 or 14 because he'd been held back. He was a product of the foster care system. His dad had killed his mom when he was very little. And he asked to hold the baby. And the mom was a little nervous because Darren was big and scary looking. And she said yes, and he held the baby, he took it in the corner and just rocked it, and he was great with the baby. And the baby nestled in his chest. And when he came back, he handed the baby over, and he asked the mom, "Do you think it's possible to be a good dad if you've never been loved?" And so that's what these people are healing. And so when I think of Kennedy and Jessica and what Shafko's doing, that's what they're doing. My son Joshua would tell me stories about how do you deal with the girls, how you talk to them about what happened last night, how do you talk to them about safety and security. And there's just deep trauma you're dealing with. And every place I go, whether it's homeless, veterans, there's just trauma people are dealing with which we're not equipped to deal with. And the one thing that's notable about this better kind of life that these people are living is it's not oriented around happiness. It's oriented around something higher, which is joy. Happiness is what comes when we're succeeding in the things we want to succeed in, when life is going our way. Joy is what happens when we lose the sense of self. We transcend the self. And I've known Kennedy for a few years now, and I thought, oh, he's just an incredibly happy guy. Kennedy just radiates joy. And then I read the book that is sitting on your tables. And I said, how did he become so joyous out of that background, out of all that trauma? And the answer is that we have a culture right now that's oriented self and happiness and personal victories. But I hope, and I think what Kennedy illustrates is that if your ultimate aim is not self, you can actually be happier. That in our culture, we aim too low. We don't aim for joy. And so one of the things I do in my life now that I've tried to discern this lesson is I collect accounts of joy. Because I just want to know what joy is like. Often it's physical, it's movement in unison with other people, it's dancing. The novelist Zadie Smith was at a nightclub in 1999, and suddenly she heard Q-Tip, the hip-hop artist, on the sound system. And she wrote, "A rail-thin man with enormous eyes reached across a sea of bodies for my hand. He kept asking me the same thing over and over again, 'Are you feeling it?' I was. My ridiculous heels were killing me. I was terrified I might die, yet I felt simultaneously overwhelmed with delight that Can I Kick It should happen to be playing at this precise moment in history on the sound system and was now morphing into Smells Like Teen Spirit. I took the man's hand, the top of my head flew away, we danced and danced, we gave ourselves up to joy." That's one layer. There's another layer, which is what you might call emotional joy, when we're with people we really love. One of my heroes is a woman named Dorothy Day. She wrote an account of childbirth. And in the account, it ends with this paragraph. "If I had written the greatest book, composed the greatest symphony, or carved the most exquisite figure, I could not have felt the more exalted creator than I did when they placed my child in my arms. No human creature could receive or contain so vast a flood of love and joy as I often felt after the birth of my child. With this came the need to worship and to adore." And the joy I see as the highest form of joy is moral joy, the joy of people who've utterly given themselves away. And we think it's a rare thing, but I see it all the time. And those people just radiate with a goodness and a light and an incandescence that you see in Kennedy and Jessica, actually. And so that's, when you think about reorienting the culture, it's reorienting away from a culture of individualism to something that's more communal, from a culture of rationalism to something that's more emotional, from a culture of utilitarianism that's something more moral. And that's a fundamental cultural shifting of the moral compass, but it produces better benefits than anything available on the other side. Thank you, Shafko.